Welcome to the second day of the Future of the American Child journalism training, sponsored by National Press Foundation. We are in McAllen, Texas, for another day of conversations about child well-being and what the future looks like for American children. But before we get started this morning, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Heising Simons Foundation. At the center of any discussion about child well-being, I guess in any country in the world, is how the government protects and cares for children who can't care for themselves or who are in danger or need support. In the US, usually the only way the child welfare system makes the headlines is when a tragedy occurs. A child is left in a home by themselves or murdered, or when a worker neglects to do the right thing. And this sort of frames our understanding of the system's failures. But we rarely have wide public conversations about what we need to do to make it right. They certainly don't make it above the fold on the front pages of newspapers. So our first speaker this morning is actually at the forefront of a movement to tear down those walls, to be absolutely bluntly frank about what the key challenges and problems are in America's child welfare system. And much of his research and his thinking is based on the issue of race and disparities caused by race. We are actually privileged to be meeting Alan Dettlaff at a very critical moment in his life and career. Until December, he was dean of the University of Houston's Graduate College of Social Work. But I'm thinking, and he will tell you more about this, but because of some of his impassioned and very frank observations about the system, he was asked to rejoin the faculty and step down from the dean's position. I think that's a clear indication of the sort of, I don't want to use the word fragility, but the inability, I guess, of the status quo to allow for critiques and threats to the way things are. But Alan began his career as a social worker in the family policing system. And he was a caseworker and an administrator. And so one of the things he'll be telling us about is the UPEND movement. Have any of you heard of the UPEND movement? It is a movement to essentially do what Alan wants to do, and that is abolish child welfare as we know it and come up with something better. So I am really excited to hear his presentation. Alan.
Okay, well, thanks. Can y'all hear me? My mic's on? Great. Well, I'm glad to hear y'all haven't heard about the UPEND movement. I'm excited, always excited to be able to talk about that and tell new people about it. I'm going to take my phone out so I can stay on time. I'll give you a little bit of a background about me because I don't have it in the slides. So as Rachel said, I did start my career in the child welfare system, which I now refer to as the family policing system. And those of us who are involved in that movement use the term family policing system because we don't think the term child welfare really refers to what the system does. The system is actually a system of policing that its primary roles with families are to surveil them, to regulate their behavior, and then to punish them when their behavior doesn't meet the system's expectations, which are the roles mostly associated with policing. So we refer to it as a family policing system to kind of take back the language that the state has given us. I worked in that system for about 6 years, then went into academia. And while I was in the system, I worked as an investigator. So my job was to investigate allegations of maltreatment and then to take children away from their parents in certain cases. And I would estimate in the time that I was there, I removed probably at least 100 children from their families. Removals are very common in the family policing system. About over 250,000 children are forcibly separated from their families every year in that system. It wasn't until after I left the system that I became involved in some of the state of Texas efforts to address what the system calls racial disproportionality, which is the overrepresentation of Black children. And that's when I really started to understand my own complicity in the system, how my biases impacted the decisions that I made in the system. I was able to look back and see that, yes, most of the children that I removed were Black and brown children. And in many cases, now that I had been removed from the system for a while, I was able to see that in most of those cases, those children really didn't need to be removed, that there were other things that could have been done in those families. But I think of it as just a culture of removal in that system where that's just what's done. And many times those removals are done out of fear of liability on the part of the agency and on the part of the worker. And in not one case that I removed a child did that child ever say to me, "Thank you very much for removing me from my horrible abusive parents." It just never happened. In fact, in every case, when I would go see those children afterwards, all they would want to know is when they would get to go back home, regardless of what was happening in the home. So that really changed my orientation to the system and led to me working and doing my research for probably about 15 years as what you would call a reformer, someone who thought the system could be reformed. And I did research on racial disproportionality and why and how racism leads to these disproportionate outcomes, and ultimately came to realize that despite decades of reforms and really valiant efforts by many people to reform the system, though the numbers of Black children impacted by the system, the disproportionate numbers, never change, and in fact haven't changed over 60 years, to the point where I came to understand the system is just set up to be reform-proof, which I'll talk a little bit about today. So I identify as an abolitionist now. I've been studying the abolition movement for several years, going back to the times of slavery in the abolition movement during the era of human chattel slavery, and understanding that the goals of the abolition movement during chattel slavery were never fully realized. If you look back on the writings of people like Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, they, after abolition of slavery, after passage of the 13th Amendment, denounced the abolition movement as ending too soon. The goal of the abolition movement was never just to end slavery. It was to achieve equality and liberation for Black Americans, which has still not happened to this day, and that's what today's abolition movement is about, starting with policing in prisons, and now much of my work and other people's work has extended it to the child welfare system. So I'll give you a little bit background to the system. Actually, I think I have that on forward. What we'll talk about today is I'm going to start with some common myths and misunderstandings about the child welfare system. Then we'll talk about what we know about racial disproportionality and disparities, if you're not familiar with that. And then specifically, we're going to talk about some of the harms or the disproportionate harms that are caused to Black children and families by the system, who are largely overrepresented in the system, and then introduce abolition as a concept. If you're not familiar with UPEND, or if you're not familiar with the abolition movement broadly, we'll talk a little bit about that, and then I hope to have time to answer questions for you. As Rachel mentioned, I recently was just fired in my dean role about a month ago, specifically because of my work, my abolitionist views, my work to bring an abolitionist orientation into the College of Social Work at the University of Houston, and the tensions that brought among a small handful of my faculty. Really, it was 4 faculty that complained to the upper administration out of a faculty of 33. But those complaints were strong enough in terms of how my views had impacted them in their work to remove me from the dean role. So I'm now on faculty there. But it is, abolition is still a kind of a controversial topic in society, but in social work as well. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the defund the police movement, and I view this work as very similar to that because it really is about a reallocation of resources, but it does come with a lot of misunderstanding of what the work's really about. So I hope to clarify some of that today. So start with some myths and realities about the system. The biggest misconception of the system is that the child welfare system is a helpful, needed, benevolent system that in society we can't do without because it's needed to protect children. That's probably myth number 1. Another myth is that it's necessary to separate children from their families when they're being harmed. Myth number 3, when children are separated from their parents, they live in safe and loving foster homes. I'll tell you the reality about that in a second. And then that the child welfare system offers parents services to address whatever needs bring them to the attention of the system. And if it turns out that children can't go back to their parents for whatever reason, it's really the parents' fault because all the services were offered. All of these things are not true. In reality, more than 70% of children who are in foster care because of what the state calls neglect. Only 17% of children in foster care are in foster care because of what we would consider harm, physical or sexual abuse. So nearly 3/4 of children in foster care are in foster care because of neglect, which is largely associated with poverty in almost every case. So failure to address issues of housing, clothing, shelter, educational needs, things like that, not things that are actually considered harm to children. The other reality that many people don't understand is the harms of family separation. And I'll get into more detail about the harms of family separation. But if you're familiar with the stories of family separation that occurred a few years ago under the Trump zero tolerance policy, the nation was outraged at what was happening to children and the trauma they were experiencing at the US-Mexico border. The number of children that were removed during the entire zero tolerance policy was about 3,000. The child welfare system removes more than 3,000 children from their families every week in this country. And that pain and trauma that you all saw on TV during the Trump administration, that's the same pain and trauma that children who are separated from their families by the child welfare system experience every day. In terms of loving, caring foster homes, rates of physical and sexual abuse in foster care are 2 to 3 times higher than they are in the general public. So children are removed in some cases from harm, and then they're put in situations where they experience even more harm. Those rates are even higher when you think about group home facilities. Texas is under a consent decree right now because of children being trafficked out of their group homes. Specifically, homes for girls who have experienced trafficking are being trafficked out of their group homes here in Texas. That's how bad the abuse is in foster care. Parents actually receive no support or services related to their actual needs. So, Rachel mentioned the example of a child who goes into foster care because a mom leaves her home alone and because she can't afford daycare to go to work. There was just a story in December on CBS Sunday Morning about a child who was separated from her mother because her mother left her at home because she had to go to work. If she didn't go to work, she would lose her job, they would lose their housing. The child was removed. So what does that parent need to help her? Daycare, right. The system doesn't have money for daycare. The system will send her to parenting classes. They'll send her to get a psychological examination. They'll send her to get a drug test. The system has no actual material resources to give people. If you think of the case of Ma'Khia Bryant, really quickly, everybody knows that case, right? So Ma'Khia Bryant's mother was having concerns about how to take care of her 2 teenage daughters that she felt were getting kind of out of control. She went looking for help. She was ultimately reported to Child Protective Services through a hotline. Because of some mental health concerns about her, the children were placed with their grandmother. Their grandmother, after a few weeks, was evicted from her apartment because too many people were living there after she took in these 2 children. She went to her caseworker and said, "I'm being evicted from my apartment. Can you help me find another apartment that allows kids, allows more people in it?" The caseworker said, "No, bring the children here." And they went into foster care, and then Ma'Khia Bryant was ultimately murdered in her foster home. There was no abuse happening there. They needed money. What would have happened if Ma'Khia Bryant's mother was wealthy? They would have gone to therapy, right? She didn't know how to take care of her teenage daughters. They would have figured it out. They would have brought in a live-in nanny. Ma'Khia Bryant wound up murdered because her family was poor and because the system literally has no material resources. They don't have rent to give to people. They don't have money. They don't have daycare services. So the system doesn't actually meet the needs of parents. Part of their job is to refer parents to services, so they might refer parents to something like Catholic Charities that could help access, I actually don't know if they could access reduced things like daycare, subsidies and things like that. But part of their job is to connect them to various resources, but they don't actually have the material resources to connect them with. And parents don't need CPS involvement to access those resources. It's not like CPS has to be the go-between to access those resources. They're there already. So, and then what we're going to talk about a lot on the next few slides is this issue of racial disparities and how that disproportionately impacts Black children. So just as a quick background, racial disproportionality, which refers to the overrepresentation of black children in the system, has been observed in the system since its earliest origins. We can trace the modern child welfare system back to about the 1960s. Since that time, black children have been overrepresented in the system. And by overrepresentation, I mean the second point. Disproportionality occurs when a group in the system, say a racial group in this case, is overrepresented, meaning they're proportionately larger. Their proportion in the system is larger than their proportion in the population. So that has most significantly impacted black children. Black children are in the system at a rate of about 25% of children in the system. Black children are only about 12 to 15% of children in the general population. So that's what disproportionality means. Racial disproportionality also occurs to some degrees for Latinx children, indigenous children, but it kind of varies by state. If we were to look at a state graph, well, I'll show you this national graph here. If we were to look at a state graph, you would see black children overrepresented in every single state. Latinx children are overrepresented in about 15 states. Indigenous children, the same. Some rates of indigenous overrepresentation is incredibly large in states with large populations of indigenous families. But then in some states, there's no presence of indigenous children at all. So black children have really been the most impacted and have gotten the most attention in terms of research. If you look at this bottom row here, this is black children. Again, represent about 15% of the children in the population, but about 25% of children in foster care. If you go up to that green line, you could see that white children are larger in the general population and then go down in foster care. Same for Latinx children. The small number, the light blue bar on the top, is indigenous children. They're only about 1% of the national population, but they're about 2.5% of the foster care population. So they're actually overrepresented at a rate almost 2.5 times their proportion. But again, because it's so small and regional, it hasn't received the same type of national attention as the issue with black children has received. And so racial disproportionality then is specific to this number of kids in foster care and children being overrepresented in foster care. Racial disproportionality happens because of racial disparities at different entry points to the system, different exit points from the system. So, and at every point of contact, we see black children being disproportionately impacted by the system. So black children are more likely to be called into child welfare hotlines. That's actually the place where there's the most disparity, particularly among teachers and medical providers, over-report black children. And there's a lot of research that has showed that for similar issues, black children are more likely to be reported to CPS than white children. Say 2 children, a white child and a black children, go to a hospital with a head injury. The doctors, the medical staff, are more likely to believe a white parent that it was an accident, and they're more likely to refer the black child to Child Protective Services. So there's lots of research that shows where the disparities happen there. But then black children are also more likely to be confirmed for maltreatment, and then they're significantly more likely to be removed and placed into foster care versus receiving services in the home. And then once in foster care, black children are much less likely to exit foster care. They're more likely to have their parental rights terminated. They're more likely to stay in foster care and what we call age out of foster care when they turn 18. So at every point of the system, these different entry points and exit points lead to black children being overrepresented in the system. In terms of why racial disproportionality and disparities exist, the most important thing to understand is that there's no evidence that shows that rates of maltreatment are different across racial groups. So there's no evidence that black children are actually maltreated more than white children or Latinx children. What we do know in the literature is mostly theories based on different pockets of evidence, and if you could kind of categorize those into 4 things. What some people refer to as disproportionate need, meaning that poverty is a strong correlate of maltreatment, and black children are more likely to be living in poverty. One of the factors that's difficult to kind of explain there is that's also the case for Latinx children. Latinx children are more likely to be overrepresented among people living in poverty, but they're not overrepresented in the child welfare system. So it's really more of a function of a specific anti-black racism that's contributing to children being in the system. The second point is specific to racial bias in hotline reporters, racial biases among staff. Sometimes those are implicit biases, but sometimes those are explicit biases as well. Child welfare system factors, it's a very young, untrained workforce with lots of turnover. Turnover or rates of longevity in child welfare systems are about 2 years. So, right at the time where you think you might know what you're doing in the job, you leave and go somewhere else. So it's a just highly untrained workforce. And then some geographic context issues. Places where there is concentrated poverty often come with many of the risk factors that are associated with maltreatment. So lower income neighborhoods sometimes lead to maltreatment. It's really likely that all of these things interact together to cause racial disproportionality. But what's important to know is that when you look at each of these things, there are some people, even contemporaries of mine in social work, who will say that racism isn't a problem in the child welfare system, it's just poverty. But even if you can think that maybe the poverty issue is the strongest issue, maybe the fact that Black children and families are more likely to live in poverty than other children and families, why are Black children and families more likely to live in poverty? Because of hundreds of years of structural and institutional racism in the US. So all of these factors ultimately lead to racism as the cause. If you look here, this is kind of a chart that shows what I mean by this. I think it's important to go back to the times of slavery and consider that the history of family separations in this country actually began during slavery. Black children were forcibly separated from their parents during slavery for the specific purpose of maintaining compliance of parents who were enslaved, and the threat of family separation was used to prevent an uprising by those who were enslaved, because at any moment their child could be forcibly taken and sold away from them. So that history of slavery is important to keep in context here of the way that Black families think about the child welfare system today. I always think when I show this part, I had one case where a child was removed. It was about a 10-year-old Black boy, lived on the east side of Fort Worth in a predominantly Black neighborhood. He was displaying some inappropriate sexual behaviors with other neighborhood children, more than you would consider normal experimentation for a 10-year-old. And because of some factors in the home where there was not a lot of supervision, my supervisor felt it was necessary to remove that child because there's a suspicion that a child is being sexually abused when they're displaying those kind of behaviors. We didn't have evidence of that. I ultimately don't think the child needed to be removed, but I was directed to remove the child. When I went to the house with the police to remove the child, Charles was his name, his mother said, "Charles, run to your bedroom, go out the window, they're coming here and they're gonna sell you to the white people." That's what people think, or many Black communities, families think about what the child welfare system does right now, that its purpose is to take Black children away to give them, if not sell them, to white people. And that's played out then in the rates of Black children that are adopted by white families by the child welfare system. That's in a lot part where that comes from. But then when we look beyond that, we see just poverty. Again, since abolition of slavery, Black codes, Jim Crow laws, all of these things have created the conditions today that make it more likely that Black children and families experience poverty. Health and stress, there's research that shows that the daily experience of racism actually impacts the physical health, not just the mental health, but the physical health of Black Americans. It's a concept called weathering, where your body actually just physically breaks down because of the experience of racism. So we know that that's part of what impacts. And then again, geographic context, things like racial residential segregation, redlining, all of these things collectively lead to what some people will refer to as disproportionate need. But all of these disproportionate needs come from a history of racism in the United States. When you look at the history of the child welfare system itself, I'll just spend a couple minutes here because this could be a whole kind of 40-minute thing itself. But it's important to point out, this is a picture of what was called the orphan trains. The orphan trains were a movement that started just post-abolition of slavery, where there were a large population of white orphans in the New York Northeast area. They were orphaned due to illness, due to poor working conditions, indentured servitude type conditions, and a minister organized a children's aid society to move those children from the streets of New York to rural homes in the Midwest, which was rapidly expanding at that time. So they moved to these homes. They were used for their labor, but it was in exchange for this rural family upbringing, which was believed then they would be able to re-enter society as productive, moral citizens of the country. So people will often talk about the case that the orphan trains moved over 200,000 children from the streets of New York to what we would consider foster homes in the Midwest. What often isn't explained that the system removed over 200,000 white children. Black children were on purpose excluded from this system. So the system began as a system that was designed to care for poor white children with the intentional exclusion of black children. Once we get into the modern era of the system, like the 1930s to the 1960s, we see things like the Social Security Act and aid to dependent children. Aid to dependent children, when it first started in the 1930s, was specifically designed for poor, widowed white mothers so that they could stay home and take care of their children and would not have to enter the workforce. As more and more black families became eligible for that, aid to dependent children started to develop rules that were called like unsuitability clauses. So immorality clauses, which were mostly related to an unmarried man living in the house, illegitimate children rules, and they were not eligible for aid to dependent children. So that, again, was designed to exclude black families from getting this kind of aid. That led to the Fleming Rule in the 1960s, which said that those kind of eligibility restrictions could no longer be used. But what happened then is for every black child who was kicked off of a registry, off of a state's welfare rolls because of one of these unsuitability clauses, then their families were investigated. And if they were deemed to be living in poverty or living in a poor home, then they were removed and placed into foster care. So you see in the early 1960s, tens of thousands of children, mostly from the South, entered foster care, which created the disproportionality that has maintained to this day. CAPTA, the Child Abuse and Prevention and Treatment Act, was the act that started mandatory reporting, passed in 1974. At that time, it was specifically known by legislators, if you go back and look at the transcripts. They knew that mandatory reporting laws, and specifically linking what they were calling neglect to abuse under this umbrella of maltreatment, they knew that that would disproportionately harm black children and black families. But they didn't care. They passed the law anyways. So often, and the same is true for ASFA, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, legislators knew that that would disproportionately impact black children, and more black children would be terminated from their parental rights would be terminated. Often in the child welfare system, you hear about unintended consequences of some of these policies. When legislators know that a policy is going to disproportionately harm one group of children, they pass the law anyways, and then those disproportionate harms become reality. That's not unintentional then. Those are intentional consequences that were known and preventable. And then even when you get to things like the best interest of the child standard, best interest of the child standard is the standard used to govern all child welfare cases. Even the Supreme Court said in 1981 that the best interest of the child standard is subject to biases based on who's reviewing the case. So it's known to result in biases. Court-appointed special advocates, are you all familiar with CASA, the CASA program? Some of you, CASA program is a program where a volunteer who's supposed to be unbiased reviews a case of a child and makes a recommendation to the judge. The CASA workforce is about 90% white middle-class women who are then given enormous control over what happens to this majority of black children, or a large proportion of black children in the system. And we've seen through data that CASA involvement leads to greater overrepresentation of black children in the system. So all of these things, since the history of the child welfare system, are kind of designed to lead to these outcomes. There's also here's some evidence, research that I was involved in that show how bias plays out in the system itself. As I said, when I left the system, I got involved in some of the state's efforts to address disproportionality. We looked at several years of data in the system in the early 2000s and looked at differences in substantiation rates, which is the decision of yes or no, did maltreatment occur, and removal rates. And we were able to control for things like income, risk factors, which is basically a statistical technique to kind of hold everything else equal to isolate the effect of a child's race. And what we found is that after controlling for things like poverty, risk, black children were still 15% more likely than white children to be found confirmed for maltreatment, even though we were controlling for risk. And then I think this is the most important thing. Among maltreated children, black children were 20% more likely to be deemed in need of some type of service. And then of those children, black children were 77% more likely than white children to enter foster care in lieu of receiving services in their homes. Again, controlling for poverty, risk, type of maltreatment, the only thing different between these cases was the child's race. Black children were 77% more likely to go into foster care. That's evidence of bias in the system. Another thing here, these are risk scores for Black families and white families, for high-income families and for low-income families. And you could see there the darker green bar is Black families and the lighter green bar is white families. What we found is that families with low income across the board were scored to have higher risk than high-income families, which was not surprising. But what we found is that across the board, Black families were scored as having lower risk than white families, although Black children were 77% more likely to enter foster care. What that says is there's a difference in how caseworkers make decisions about families, meaning that for a white family to experience removal, the risk has to be that much higher than Black families, whereas Black children are removed at lower levels of risk. So to me, going back to this language issue of why I call it a family policing system, we often use the terms racial disproportionality, racial disparities. I think the more accurate term is racist inequities because it highlights the active role of racism that contributes to the inequities that we see. When we see something like racial disproportionality, racial disparities, it's kind of a passive thing that just kind of happens to Black children, or is more likely to happen to Black children, but it's not passive. It's an active force of racism that is impacting the disparities that we see. So racist inequities is the term that I use in my work. And now kind of the crux of how we get to take all of this and get to the abolition movement. Disproportionate involvement causes disproportionate harm. Going back to family separation, what we know about family separation causes immense harm to children, lifelong trauma, regardless of how long that separation occurs. So children that are separated for 2 weeks, children who are separated from 2 years, experience the same kinds of trauma and harm. And this is true across the board in terms of types of family separation. Children separated at the border, children who are separated due to parental incarceration, children who are separated due to a sudden unexpected death, and children who are separated by the family policing system experience the same types of trauma. And that trauma later in life is associated with things like cognitive delays, increased aggression, poor educational outcomes, as well as significant physical health differences, things like obesity, diabetes, hypertension. So physical health consequences of separation as well. But then following separation, it's really a two-part thing. You have the harm and trauma that comes from the act of separation, and then you have the harm and trauma that comes from foster care. And there's an entire body of research that shows poor outcomes that result from foster care. The studies that I've picked out here, and there's a link at the bottom of these slides here where these are all found, is there's a small number of studies, this is hard to do, but there's a small number of studies that have compared children who've experienced similar types of maltreatment. So not really severe maltreatment and not kind of maltreatment that wouldn't result in foster care, somewhere in the middle. And they've looked at the children who've experienced that type of maltreatment. Some go into foster care, some stay at home. Sometimes those are regional differences, depending on the philosophy of the agency. Sometimes those are caseworker differences. But they're able to compare outcomes for children who go into foster care and children who stay at home and get services when they've experienced similar types of maltreatment. And across the board, they find that children who go into foster care are more likely to have higher delinquency rates, more likely to higher teen birth rates, lower earnings as adults, learning disability problems, physical health problems, mental health problems, more likely to be arrested and incarcerated. So just the experience of foster care itself leads to poor outcomes for children. So what you have then, it's important to kind of point out that foster care is bad for all children. All children experience those or are at risk of experiencing those poor outcomes. The problem is that Black children in America are already at risk of experiencing these poor outcomes because of the racism in society that they have had to contend with for decades, if not centuries in society. So Black children in America are already at greater risk than white children of experiencing poverty, homelessness, poor educational outcomes, incarceration. When you then add on top of that trauma inflicted by a system through family separation and foster care that also results in those things, it just makes it more likely that Black children are going to experience those outcomes. So I actually think of the family policing system as an active agent of oppression because the system's intervention is causing the conditions that maintain the oppression of Black families, Black Americans in the United States. Poverty, homelessness, joblessness, poor education, incarceration. The child welfare system causes each of those things through its intervention, and it causes them disproportionately for Black children. So some things that kind of led to the abolition movement forming several years ago. Can a system that began with a racist intent, leading all the way back to post-abolition in the 1800s, evolve into a system that achieves equity? Can decades of racist policies be reformed to no longer produce racist outcomes? And really, is racial equity an appropriate goal for a system that produces harm? I'll get into that one in a second. To me, the answer to all of these things is no, which led to the UPEND movement to abolish the child welfare system. So the UPEND movement discussions about UPEND started in 2018, 2019, with me and a couple policymakers from the Center for the Study of Social Policy, which is a think tank out of Washington, D.C. The four of us have been involved in various aspects of child welfare work. So me as a caseworker and administrator, another as a family attorney, and then two others as administrators in high-level systems. Bill Betancourt, one of my partners, was the director of the San Francisco child welfare system for about a decade. So we come with a lot of experience inside the system as different aspects. And again, realize that we have been having these conversations, being engaged in reform efforts, working hand in hand with states. I worked as a consultant with Illinois, with Texas, with other states on their reform efforts, and saw no matter what we did, nothing changed. And the reason nothing changes is because none of those reforms are ever willing to consider ending the use of family separation. Reforms in the child welfare system basically tweak around the edges. They try to make it a little bit nicer system, a little bit less racist. When you're involved in the prison abolition movement, when you think about prison reforms, people in that movement often say that reforms lead to nicer, friendlier cages, but nicer, friendlier cages are still cages. And that's what I think about child welfare system reforms. They focus on system improvements, but the fundamental act of harm, of family separation, is never changed. So why upend? Because decades of research have documented not only the existence of disproportionality, but the harmful outcomes of disproportionality. And despite, as I was just saying, despite decades of reforms, literally reforms to the system have been going on since the 1960s. The state of Texas has been under a consent decree for nearly a decade, and nothing ever changes. So when you put all of this together, a system that causes harm, a system that causes harm disproportionately to Black children and families, a system that has demonstrated itself to be reform-proof, the only solution is to think of a different way of responding to children in need. So reforms are no longer sufficient, and eliminating the problems in the system, eliminating the racial disparities that exist in the system, eliminating the harm and trauma that result from the system, really the only solution to that is abolition of the system. Abolition is a strong word, so I want to unpack that a little bit. But first, going back to UPEND, I want to point out that UPEND is kind of emerging. We've been in the child welfare abolition movement in the United States has been active for about 3 years right now. Many of you have probably heard of the policing abolition movement, or prison abolition has been going on since the 1960s. Policing abolition really just started around 2020 with the defund movement. Prior to that, it was largely a prison abolition movement. It's now a prison and policing abolition movement. Child welfare has really just been actively talking about abolition for several years now. But we're really talking about what abolition ultimately is, which is a simultaneous process of ending the harmful part of the system, ending involuntary separation, while also building something in its place. Not a government system, but means of caring for children and families that don't involve state-sanctioned family separation. In other words, we're trying to address societal problems like poverty, homeless, lack of adequate food, lack of employment or employment opportunities, by at the root causes of those things. The child welfare system often thinks in terms of individual pathology. So when parents are poor, it's their fault, they're not trying enough, their children need to be separated from them to get the aid that they need. Poverty, homelessness, unemployment, those are structural societal problems that there are means to change through government mechanisms that the government is not willing to do. There are solutions government solutions to poverty the government is aware of and chooses not to. So poverty is a governmental societal problem, not a problem of individual parents. We want to shift that through abolition. So I have some quotes here from abolition, and you probably see me going like this because I forgot my glasses on this trip, so I have to get a little bit closer to read these. But I think these two quotes are good in terms of explaining what abolition is about. Derica Purnell is a really incredibly knowledgeable, more recent policing abolitionist. She just came out with a book called Becoming Abolitionists, if you're interested in learning more about it. And she says that abolition is not merely the absence of police, it's eliminating root causes of harm, and it's eliminating the kind of society that could rely on police to solve that harm. So it's really about changing society to the point where we don't need police. Robin D.G. Kelley says that abolition works to dismantle systems that cause harm and reallocate funds to social and economic resources, and to develop new systems of community-controlled public safety and restorative justice. So if you think about the defund movement, it really is about taking money away from the police and putting that money and then reinvesting that money into families and communities that need that. People tend to focus just on the defund part and forget about what that money is going to be used for, and that's led to some misunderstandings about that movement. But the for abolition movement is really essentially about the same thing. If you think about, again, going back to the fact that 70% of children are in foster care because of poverty-related issues. What we have is a system that takes children away from their parents because of poverty, and then puts the children in the home of a stranger, and then pays that stranger money to take care of someone else's children. What if we just gave the mom in need the money that we're giving to foster parents? In Texas, we give foster parents an average of about $900 a month. What if we just gave $900 a month to a mom who's struggling, every mom who's struggling to meet their child's needs? We would literally not have a need for foster care. And that not only addresses the poverty-related issues, but because poverty is so strongly related to physical maltreatment as well, there's studies that show that just a small amount of direct material assistance to families at high risk of maltreatment reduces actual rates of maltreatment. So if we just started with the 70% of kids who are in care for being neglected, if you think the child welfare system has a $30 billion budget, if we took 70% of that, let's just say like $20 billion, and reallocated that $20 billion to poor families in need, that could fundamentally change the landscape of this country. And then it could also start to address the issues in which there are actual maltreatment in those cases. So while abolition does intend to completely end the system, it's really much less about ending the system as it is about building a new society, new ways to care for children and families that don't involve a harmful intervention. We're literally right now responding to harm or attempting to respond to harm by inflicting further harm on children through family separation and foster. As a society that says we care about children, we can't continue to do that. As a society that has used family separation as a means of controlling and subjugating Black 1800s, we have to consider, is that something we could keep doing in society given all of the problems of racism that still exist in this country? So in this, abolition isn't simply about ending something. It's really about building something new so that these systems are obsolete. In policing, it's about reducing the amount of funds that go to police and redirecting that, and thinking about safety as something that comes not from police, but safety as something that comes from high quality, free public education, free and accessible health care, mental health care, substance use services, domestic violence services, free and accessible, all of those, daycare, free and accessible daycare. All of those things we literally wouldn't need. We wouldn't need police, we wouldn't need a child welfare system if we had those things. So by abolition, I want to be clear though, we do mean the complete elimination of the system, the complete total elimination of the child welfare system, not a replacement of another system. People often ask, well, what will you replace it with? Not a government system. This really is about shifting power, shifting resources to families and communities. People will often ask, and I'll preempt it now because some of you will probably ask, well, what about the children who are really abused? The best way that I've come to answer that system is to think about, or that question, is think about your own family. Think about the network of people that you love and care about. Imagine that a child is harmed in that family by someone who's also part of that network, what would you want to do? Would you want to sit down as a family, as a community of people who love and care about each other and figure out what needs to happen to protect that child? Or would you want the government to take that child away from you and to figure out on their terms how to protect the child? I think most of you would pick option one. You figure it out. Decide. And if you want that for yourself, then you would want that for every family. And if you want that for every family, that's what abolition looks like.
I just said for more than black. So what happens when that caregiver and that child doesn't have a family system? What type of conversations do they have then? Who is supposed to get involved if mom isn't around, grandma isn't around, auntie isn't around? It's just her and the child, him and the child. What happens then?
It's about, part of this work is about kind of building up communities so that communities care about each other, which again, this is not, I mean, it's important to point out, abolition is not an overnight process. This is, a decades-long process of shifting resources from the government to communities with the idea that if we build up communities, then there's community support that can care for each other. There's community resources, so even if a mom is alone and doesn't have a lot of family supports, that mom is part of a community where she knows she can go to and get the services that they need without the fear that she's going to go access those services and someone's going to call a hotline on her. That's the idea, that it's the community have the resources. And that's actually what happened in the times going back to the orphan train movement, when black children were intentionally excluded from all of those services. You may have heard of like Jane Addams and the settlement house movement. Black children were excluded from all of those. That was a whites-only system for decades. What happened is black families, black communities together, and they started their own services. They started their own organizations that depended on philanthropy to keep them going. But this is about trusting black families and communities that if they have the resources that they can work, and not just black families, all families and communities, kind of starting with black families who are the most impacted, but then being able to care for themselves without the need for a harmful government intervention.
Henry Gass, I'm with the Christian Science Monitor. I'm based in Texas as well. I'm interested in what you think about sort of oversight in this system you're describing to replace what you call the licensing system, which is very much about oversight and invasive oversight. I mean, does that need to be there? Or doesn't there need to be some degree of making sure that it's working and that children aren't being harmed by whoever is responsible for caring for them, whether it's their immediate families or someone else?
Mm-hmm. I think that's an absurd question at this point. Abolition, steps to abolition haven't happened yet. But what I find is when we think about abolition, and particularly people that are new to abolition, the worst case scenarios tend to pop into our brains, like the what if cases versus the positive possibilities of that. And then it prevents us from doing anything. Where I think with something like abolition, you don't have to know, I'm not going to present to you the 10-point plan to get to abolition today, because it literally doesn't exist. All we really need to know to start working towards abolition is that what we have now is not acceptable to maintain, and we have to do something different. And we should be trying to work towards that. Is there going to need to be some type of surveillance? Maybe surveillance is something that we gradually decrease. As we're gradually reallocating funding to families and communities, the systems of surveillance initially stay in place, but gradually decrease until these kind of systems of care are set up in communities. Again, acknowledging that this is a decades-long process. But ultimately, we want to get to the point in society where families aren't surveilled by the government to ensure that they're safe. Again, going back to the idea that right now, more than 70% of kids are not in the system even because of a safety issue. So I know it's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but the real answer is I don't know if surveillance will be needed. The goal is for it to not be needed ultimately when we get to the point we want to get to.
Here's another way to think of this that I'm finding absolutely fascinating. Last night, our last speaker was Dr. David Schoenfeld, who runs the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. Mm-hmm. And one of the points he made that I was mind blown about was that a school that's been involved in a school shooting, by federal rules, cannot build back better. In other words, the money that they get, they have to return the school to its exact same, the way it looked before. Can't think about adding a mental health center, can't think about adding, anything other than maybe metal detectors or bars on windows. So when you think about the defund police movement, everyone immediately rushes to think that means they're going to take away policemen and leave us all at our own peril. So when we're talking about this conversation about changing child welfare, instead of opening a space to discuss ways to do it better, there's an automatic lockdown. There's an automatic sense of, no, we can't do that because all the children will be killed if we do that, or whatever. I find this kind of conundrum, it's fascinating to me how common sense stuff that we rail against as a society.
It's partly due to the fact that the world we want to create, where there's not a need for policing and child welfare systems, in a lot of ways is beyond our imagination to understand what that could look like, because we're socialized to think those are indispensable things in society. Like imagining a society without police is difficult for people to do. But at the same time, then it leads to the worst case scenarios. Well, what is this case, and what about this case, and what about that? And then we don't try anything. So that's what I'm trying to push back against.
Yeah.
So I have a kind of Texas-specific question. My name is Kayla Harris. I'm from the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News. I'm curious for your thoughts on community-based care in Texas and kind of how you look at that through a racial lens and through your research lens. It's basically, in Texas, we're trying to privatize our foster care system, and across the state, like the idea is that community organizations, nonprofits take over the role of our child welfare agency. So yeah, just curious what that looks like for you.
Yeah, it's a scam. It's a statewide swindle that the state is trying to pull over on people, because it's the exact same thing. It's just the state taking some of their in-house state money, giving it to community agencies, but then requiring those community agencies to do their work. It's not really community-based care the way that I think of community-based care. It's a community agency doing the policing work of Child Protective Services under the guise of community-based care. You'll see lots of attempts, like, again, it's about the language that the system used. Community-based care sounds great. Like you're probably thinking, I'm talking about community-based care. That's not what the state is talking about. The state is just talking about an agency being kind of charged with doing their work on their behalf.
Hi, I'm Krista Johnson with the Courier-Journal. I have kind of a personal question. I imagine the reason you went into social work was because you were passionate about helping children. At what point in that 6 years did you realize you were causing harm rather than?
I didn't realize it while I was in the system. And I don't think that most people in the system realize that they're causing harm because of the culture that system breeds. You having been in the system, and even having been in the system after that, the way that system thinks about parents, if you could hear the way that caseworkers, administrators talk about parents, it's horrific. They're just viewed to be like the lowest dredges of society, and removal is viewed as saving children and families. The racial biases are completely unchecked. I worked in Fort Worth during my time here, and there was a neighborhood on the east side of Fort Worth that I always remember because it has these street names that were like Avenue G, Avenue H, Avenue K. Entirely poor black neighborhood. When the group of investigators that I work with, when we would get a case to go out to that neighborhood, just looking at the referral, the thing that comes in through the hotline, we would say, we need to bring the car seat on this one. Meaning that we were deciding before we even went out there that we were bringing somebody's baby back with us, which is just horrifically racist and biased. But I could blame it on the fact that I was a poorly trained 20-something. That's not a good excuse, but there's also no one in the agency who's checking that bias either. No one who's working to discount that kind of attitude about families. And what you really see happen is the way it plays out when you're, again, this is a young, inexperienced workforce. When you're young, inexperienced 20-something, you go into a neighborhood and you're scared to be there in the first place because of what you think happens in that neighborhood. the decisions that you make are different than when you go into the nice white gated community where you think everybody loves and cares about each other and nothing bad's happening there. Those are the kind of things, that's what it's like inside a CPS agency. So I don't think most people think they're harming kids when they're in the agency. It takes a while after they're out to realize it.
Hi, I have a question. I'm Chandra Bazelko. I'm a columnist with the National Memo. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the role of organized labor in this. I know that these are state employees. Are they organized into unions? Because we know that police unions are generally great opposition to police abolition. Is there organized labor element to this situation?
Not yet. I don't know about other states. I know that Texas doesn't have a union for state employees, or for at least for Child Protective Services employees. I remember back in my time in the system, they were trying to do that and it was not successful. Unless that's changed, somebody may know. They do have a union? Yeah. Okay, great. But I don't know how they view this. I think it's different in the sense that there's so much more national awareness of the anti-policing movement than there is about this movement being new, that I don't think they have felt the need to really organize against abolition yet. We're really still trying to kind of spread the word, which is part of why I'm here and hoping some of you will talk about this, and the parallels between child welfare abolition and policing abolition. With policing, you could literally probably go home and turn on your TV tonight and see something bad about policing, or some way that policing is harming Black communities. There's not a parallel to that yet for child welfare, and because of this myth of benevolence, indispensability, I don't think the union, so the short answer goes back to that, I don't think the unions felt the need to organize against abolition yet.
So as journalists, how do we start these conversations? How do we present a story to our community that says we don't need CPS or DHS because the kids are going to be better off without it? I think that would be really hard sell in a lot of places.
Why don't I go, I'll skip a couple of these and I can come back to them, but why don't I go for my 5 takeaways, which Rachel told me to prepare, because I think these are parts of it. The one is talking about the harms of family separation and getting people to understand that the harms of family separation that everyone was concerned about during the zero tolerance policy are the same harms of family separation that happen now, combined with point number 2, that more than 70% of children have not been harmed. They're being taken away for poverty. I don't think people understand that. So finding a story, I think if you haven't seen it, so CBS Sunday Morning, I was featured on there with another abolitionist, Dorothy Roberts, on December 4th. It was Erin Moriarty did the interview. She did this excellent profile of 2 parents, one whose child was removed because she left her home to go to her job, another whose child was taken because she wandered away while they were at the park and she couldn't find her for a couple hours. She ultimately found her, nothing happened, but someone heard about this, called CPS, ultimately removed those children. So it just talked about, tried to dispel this myth that these are children who are being harmed. These were 2 Black moms who had their children taken from them because of something that parents happens all the time, and neither of these children were harmed in either of these scenarios. I was on there talking about the fact that once parents are in the system, how difficult it is then to get your children back. People are given these service plans where they have to go to parenting classes, psychologicals, drug assessment classes, anger management sometimes if they've displayed any kind of hostility. And these are all things that they often have to pay for on their own, and they have to go to during working hours. So, and I've literally heard on the phone, I think the quote I said on the CBS show was, I've heard caseworkers say to parents when they say, I can't take all this time off of work, I'll get fired. And the caseworker will say, well, you better figure it out. This is your child. This needs to be your priority. Just no empathy there in the system. But I think these 2 points are the things people don't realize. Most kids are not being abused. The act of family separation causes immense harm. So finding a case to highlight that's not abuse. Because what often happens, what often does make it into the media, are these really serious cases, children who are starved, tortured, locked in a cage. Those are probably less than 0.5% of actual child welfare cases. But when that does happen, they're deemed newsworthy, Child Protective Services responds. That creates this idea that that's what they're doing all the time, when it's just not. So highlighting cases when harm is happening to families because of CPS, not because of the system. Highlighting the disproportionate representation of children. There was a story in, I think the Texas Observer, maybe 6 months ago, that showed that black children in Harris County, where Houston is, are 3.5 times more likely to be separated than white children for similar causes. So highlighting those huge disparities that exist. I think, we've all come to understand that issue of racial disparities more so through the COVID experience and the racial disparities that were present in the medical system, getting people to see how disproportionate these services are to children. And then, trying to open up the idea of an abolitionist conversation, at least like a reallocation conversation. I think that's probably the easiest way to get people to understand what abolition is about. That's what we learned from defund, because it only talks about the taking away part. Both of these movements, and I really consider them the same movement, are about reallocating, thinking differently about how society allocates its resources. Right now, we as a society are okay with our tax dollars going to pay strangers, who the system calls foster parents, to take care of children. We're not okay giving money directly to parents. That's a societal value problem. When I've been in talks like this before where I've said, why don't we just give the $900 to the mom who needs it? The first question I get is, how do we know that parent's not going to use that for drugs? Because that's how we've been conditioned to think about poor moms, particularly poor black moms. How do we know the foster parent is not going to use it for drugs? We don't. But there's these value issues that I think the media, the press, can try to dispel by showing some of the moms who've been harmed from this system. In one of those cases on CBS Sunday Morning, the child was ultimately terminated. The parents' rights were terminated. The mom who left the child alone one night. So pointing out that. These are the two things that UpEND mostly tries to dispel. 70% of children have not been harmed. Foster care causes immense harm.
Hiba Ansari with Sahan Journal. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that there were a few states where indigenous children were overrepresented in the system. What are those states? And can you talk a little bit about how this system interacts with families and communities who live on reservations?
I don't know the states off the top of my head. There's a really good website that the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges run. If you Google NCJ, FCJ, disproportionality, it'll bring up a disproportionality dashboard, and you could look by state disproportionality rates by race. So that's a really good resource for that. Indigenous children have a little bit more protection because of ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which the current child welfare system requires what they call reasonable efforts that they have to demonstrate before separating a child. ICWA requires active efforts, which is a little higher standard. ICWA is right now potentially going to be overturned by the Supreme Court, though. So there's a little more protections for indigenous children, but still not as many, because we still do end up with many disproportionality among indigenous children.
Maria Garnolata with W9J. Hola, thanks for being here. Could you speak to how, you kind of touched on it, but how the system interacts with Latino families a little bit more, and then also what the interaction is like with the ICE and Border Patrol and welfare system and families, and some may say, I've heard folks argue that that's kind of like a substitute to the welfare system, is like this border where they're separating families. And so if you could just talk on it, speak to that.
Yeah, it usually is immigration-related issues that lead to disproportionality issues for Latinx children. What often happens is there's kinship care, which is, rather than going into foster care, children can stay with a relative to avoid foster care in some cases. There are some states that don't allow undocumented family members to serve as kin providers. So even though there may be family who are willing to care for them, the state views that as a risk. So then children go into foster care instead of that. I've seen many cases here in Texas where parents are deported, but their children are citizens and their children stay here in foster care. But because of xenophobia, basically, rather than working to return the children to their parents in their parents' country of origin, they quickly move to a termination case because they believe it's better for a child to grow up in the United States than to be with their parents in their parents' country of origin. Things like language issues often get in the way of services. Many states, including Texas, don't have good translation services. Many times children are used as translators. Many times services in parents' languages aren't available. So things relate. And then you have many issues of cultural misunderstandings, different views about discipline, different views about about how old a child can be to stay home alone, different views about how old a child can be to take care of a younger sibling. Those are all of the reasons how I've seen like Latinx children become more involved in the system. It's usually related to cultural misunderstandings and then immigration-related issues.
If states are not willing to embrace the abolitionist framework now, what are some interim steps that they can take to reduce harm?
Interim steps and things that we're advocating for are repealing mandatory reporting laws. Well, I'll talk even more interim than that. Changing definitions of abuse would be kind of the first thing. I would like to see state statutes add the word intentional to definitions of neglect. Right now, definitions of neglect say something like the failure to provide food, shelter, clothing, something like that. I think it should say the intentional failure to provide, because there's a very big difference between intentionally withholding food from a child and not being able to afford food for a child. That would make a huge difference. Beyond that, kind of a more deep-in strategy, repealing mandatory reporting laws altogether. What some people are advocating for is laws called mandatory supporting, rather than mandatory reporting, meaning that it's a requirement for a person, if they have concerns about a child, to do something, to refer them to some helpful resource, and to document that if they're a professional, but not a CPS hotline. So if an educator sees a child come to school hungry, dirty, having slept in their car overnight, call Catholic Charities, call the food bank, call something like that, not the CPS hotline. So I'd like to see that. Then I'd like to see the Adoption and Safe Families Act repealed. That's the law that allows termination and often expedites termination, particularly if a parent is incarcerated, if a parent is dealing with substance use issues. The ASFA requires parents to basically be completely clean and to demonstrate that they're clean within 12 months, and that's just not possible sometimes. So ending ASFA would end the terminations that happen often.
I would like to add one more item to my wish list of things that I hope you all will go back to your newsrooms and do, and that is to write about UpEND, to write about this move. It's an important moment in the journey of child welfare and all of the conversations that have been had over the past few decades about how to protect children or how to not protect them. So I think, Alan, meeting you at this moment and this time was very, not only serendipitous, but was important to create a cohort of journalists who are really going to be leading the way, I think, in thinking about that. So on behalf of all of them and on NPF, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Here's our website's on the bottom there. It's upendmovement.org. This is a policy report we put out, How We End Up, which kind of outlines our strategies to get towards abolition, big high-level policy documents. We hold a convening every year, a virtual convening, if you have a chance to watch some of those clips. Last year we had a conversation with Angela Davis, which was pretty amazing, talking about the links between the prison abolition movement and the child welfare system. So all of that's available at our website.
Great.
And we have a comms director too, so you can be in touch with me and be in touch with her for anything you want to write about us.